Good evening and a warm welcome to this poetry night. It's the 24th International Literature Festival in Berlin, and I believe we also live streamed, so hello to everyone who's watching us online. A warm welcome also from me to all the participants of tonight in the order of their appearance on stage. Hannah Sullivan, who's sitting next to me, Maria Stepanova, Logan February, and Tahir Hamoud Isgil. I would also like to thank Mira Czerne, who's sitting next to Hannah Sullivan on stage, Christian Phillips and Marcel Kohler, who will be reading the German translations of the poetry we'll be hearing here tonight, and also Joshua Freeman, who is the translator of Tahir Hamoud Isgil's poetry into English and who will be our interpreter tonight. So the idea of this poetry feast is to present poems from different parts of the globe, to present their authors and the way they react to different issues, to different subjects from different angles. And the night is meant to bring these voices together and provide a glimpse into the writing of these four wonderful poets, and also show how they move through literary traditions, how they position themselves within or outside of these traditions, and how they manage to find capacities in poetry to comment on this strange new world, to allude to the motto of this year's festival. And so if you consider the thought that poetry can be a seismograph of current political, social upheavals, challenges, changes, this poetry addresses notions of oppression, exile, heritage, loneliness, but also very personal relation to language and the power of this relation. And as Simone Schröder in her kind introduction said, we will be listening to the poems in their original language version and then to a translation into German. And we will have time for a brief conversation in English after each reading. So it's a multilingual event. Do not get annoyed, please, if you do not understand everything. This is part of the idea, to have, different voices coming together. And also, all of the poets who are featured here tonight were asked to prepare a visual for us. So during the readings, we will see a visual here in the background. Actually, we're seeing one now, I only realized. And these visuals are somehow related to the artistic process, the artistic practice of the authors who are presenting them. So there is a linkage between what we're seeing and what we're hearing, and we'll certainly be talking about this in our brief conversations as well. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you Hannah Sullivan very briefly, who is sitting next to me. She's a British poet and academic. She received her PhD from Harvard and is currently a professor of English at New College in Oxford. And her first volume of poetry, entitled 3 Poems, was published in 2018, and it was awarded with the prestigious T.S. Eliot Prize and the John Pollard International Prize for the Best Poetry Debut in Great Britain and in Ireland the very same year. Her second volume of poetry, Was It For This?, was published in 2023, and it combines poetry and prose. We will listen to excerpts from both of these poetry or books tonight. So Hannah and Mira, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Such a delight to be here. I've never heard anyone reading my poems before, and I've certainly never heard anyone reading them in another language. That will be a treat. I'll begin by reading from the first poem in 3 poems, You Very Young in New York. The Mirror will read from the same poem, and we will move on from there. Rosie used to say that New York was a fairground. You'll know when it's time, when the fair is over. But nothing seems to happen. You stand around on the same street corners, smoking, thin-elbowed, looking down avenues in a lime green dress, with one arm raised, waiting to get older. Nothing happens. You try without success, the usual prescriptions, the usual essays on innocence. I love you, to the wrong person. I feel depressed. Kissing a girl, a sharpener, sea urchin, juice cleansers. But the senses, laxly fed, are self-replenishing, fresh as the first time. So even the eventual sameness has a savor for you. Even the sting when someone flinches at I love you is not unwelcome, like the ulcer on your tongue, wetted on the ridges of a tooth. And when he slams you hard against the frame, the portic sallow bruise seems truer than the speed, the spasm with which you came. So nothing happens. No matter what you try, the huge lost innocence at which you aimed recedes, like long perspectives, like the sky square at the end of Fifth whitening at dawn, unseen, as you watch the unlit cabs go by. All summer the park smelled of cloves and it was dying. Now it is Labor Day and you've been sleeping through a rainstorm, half aware of the sewage and frying peanut oil and the ozone rising in the morning heat and the sound of your roommate hooking the chain, flipping ice cubes into a brandy balloon, pouring juice over them, ruby sanguinello, till they giggle, popping their skins. The freezer throbs. He's been beating a man he met on Craigslist. He's been dreaming. Old New York, a James novel, Greenwich Village Christmas, a certain kind of frost in the meatpacking district, and the smell of the carcasses dull with the tang of freezing blood beside the skip of the Hudson Wind. You have been thinking of the building opposite at night, the lights going off, one by one, a diminished Mondrian, one ochre square where a woman undresses for the city, stroking her puffy thighs. You hear him talking on the phone about you, his petite innocente. All summer you have been eating peaches from the green market. Overripe in September, they need to rest in the icebox, sitting with their bruises. All summer you have been dreaming of fall and its brittle confection of branches.
Du, sehr jung in New York. Rosie sagte immer, New York sei ein Rummelplatz. Du wirst wissen, wann es Zeit, wann der Rummel vorbei ist. Aber irgendwie geschieht nichts. Du stehst rum. An derselben Straßenecke, rauchend, die Ellbogen dünn, schaust Alleen runter in einem lindgrünen Kleid. Mit einem Arm oben wartest du, älter zu werden. Nichts geschieht. Du versuchst ohne Erfolg. Die üblichen Verordnungen, üblichen Prüfungen der Unschuld. Ich liebe dich, zur falschen Person. Ich fühle mich depressiv. Ein Mädchen küssen, einen Anspitzer, Seeigel, Saft ist gesund. Aber die Sinne, lasch gefüttert, sind selbsterneuernd. Frisch wie zum ersten Mal, dass selbst das unvermeidlich Gleiche einen Geschmack für dich hat. Selbst der Stich, wenn jemand zurückschreckt bei einem Ich liebe dich, ist nicht unwillkommen. Wie das Geschwür auf deiner Zunge, gespitzt an der Kante eines Zahns. Und als er dich hart gegen den Rahmen stößt, scheint der porengereizte bleichblaue Fleck wahrer als die Schnelle, der Spasmus, mit dem du kamst. Also geschieht nichts, was du auch versuchst. Die riesige, verlorene Unschuld, auf die du zieltest, zieht sich zurück wie Weitsicht, wie der Himmel, die Kreuzung am Ende der 5. weiß wird im Sonnenaufgang, ungesehen, während du unbeleuchtete Taxis vorbeifahren siehst. Den ganzen Sommer roch der Park nach Nelken und er starb. Nun ist der Tag der Arbeit und du hast den Regensturm durchgeschlafen, halb im Bewusstsein des Abwassers, brutzelnden Erdnussöls und Ozons, das in der Morgenhitze steigt, und dem Geräusch deines Mitbewohners, der die Kette einhängt, Eiswürfel in einen Cognac-Schwenker schnippt, sie mit Saft übergießt, Ruby Sanguinello, bis sie glucksen, ihre Häute platzen, die Kühltruhe tropft. Er hat einen Mann verprügelt, den er auf Craigslist traf. Er hat geträumt vom alten New York, einem James-Roman, einer Greenwich Village-Weihnacht, einer gewissen Art des Frosts im Meatpacking District und dem Kadavergeruch, taub vom Gestank gefrierenden Bluts neben dem hüpfenden Hudson-Wind. Nachts hast du über das Gebäude gegenüber nachgedacht, die Lichter. Wie eins nach dem anderen ausgeht, ein verminderter Mondrian, einzeln ockerfarbenes Quadrat, in dem eine Frau sich für die Stadt auszieht, ihre aufgedunsenen Schenkel streicht. Du hörst ihn am Telefon über dich reden, seine Petite Innocente. Den ganzen Sommer hast du Pfirsiche vom Biomarkt gegessen. Überreif im September müssen sie in der Eisbox ruhen mit ihren blauen Flecken. Den ganzen Sommer hast du vom Herbst geträumt, seiner zerbrechlichen Konstruktion von Zweigen.
So we started. We started reading from the beginning of Three Poems. Now we'll turn to the closing pages and read two short sections from a poem called The Sandpit After Rain. It's a poem about my father's death and 6 months later the birth of my son by caesarean section. So this is a description of the operation. Once they began, I was calmer. I enjoyed the gush of the knife and the sound of the scissors, the slop of my bowel being set to one side, the look on the surgeon's face, his attentiveness and shock. Could someone pass me the forceps, please? And then, almost too soon, he was looking away at the ascension of the enormous baby boy rising over the curtain into the neon ceiling and the glowing plinth of green, twitching, hacked about. The fish thrashing on the hook that happened to it. Well, of course, who wants to be born? And to be hauled out in a windowless room somewhere near Paddington to Radio 5 Live, to be born purple, your hair scrambled like eggs. I've never heard a person so incredulous with rage. And then they couldn't stop the bleeding. Everything was larger than they thought, they said. The baby, the placenta, the vessels, even the womb. So I lay on the table hemorrhaging and the alarm bell rang and the consultant asked what uterine tonics have been administered. Oxytocin, agometrin. It sounded like a restaurant kitchen. Someone was washing up the fish knives. And my husband had a face in his hands, grave despite the monkey hat, benignant, black-eyed, magnanimous. Late on summer Saturdays, this is what the verdure sweeps. Ombre moons, pistachios, ash, hearts cut from upcycled maps, scalloped bits of Austen novels, hot pushed handfuls of white petals. This is what the broom releases: acetate of camel lights, pheromones of human fear, public libraries' unwashed armpits, sweet sweat like a pound cake, rising modern roses, nothingness. This is how things mix together, matter's endgame of fawn done. The inevitable greyish Purcell makes its money from. So, when something singular comes along, it is a miracle. Hail, tap dancers down the tarmac, skittering in its silver shoes.
Sandkasten nach Regen. Sobald sie anfingen, war ich ruhiger. Ich genoss den Strom des Messers und das Geräusch der Schere, das Flutschen meines Darms beim Zur-Seite-Schieben, den Gesichtsausdruck des Chirurgen, seine Aufmerksamkeit, seinen Schock. Kann mir jemand die Zange reichen, bitte? Und dann, fast zu schnell, schaute er weg, zur Aszension des gigantischen kleinen Jungen, der über den Vorhang zur Neondecke aufstieg und die leuchtende Plinte aus Grün, zuckend, zerhackt, Der Fisch zappelt am Haken, der ihm zustößt. Verständlich, denn wer will schon geboren werden? Und so rausgezogen werden in einen fensterlosen Raum, irgendwo nahe Paddington zu Radio 5 Live. Lila geboren werden, dein Haar wie Rührei zerzaust. Nie habe ich eine Person so fassungslos vor Wut gehört. Und dann konnten sie die Blutung nicht stoppen. Alles war größer, als sie dachten, sagten sie. Das Baby, die Plazenta, die Gefäße, sogar die Gebärmutter. Also lag ich auf dem Tisch, blutend. Die Alarmglocke schrillte und die Fachärztin fragte, welche Uterustonika wurden verabreicht? Oxytocin, Ergometrin. Es klang wie eine Restaurantküche. Jemand spülte die Fischmesser. Und mein Mann hatte ein Gesicht in seiner Hand. Gewichtig, trotz des Affenkopfs, gütig, schwarzäugig, großmütig. Spät an Sommersamstagen ist dies, was der Küster kehrt. Ombre Monde, Pistazien, Asche, Herzen gestanzt aus ehemaligen Karten, zerdellte Stellen aus Austens Romanen, warm gedrückte Handvoll weißer Blüten. Dies ist, was den Besen entfährt, Acetate von Camel Lights, Pheromone menschlicher Angst, ungewaschene Armbeugen öffentlicher Bibliotheken, süßer Schweiß, der wie Rührteig aufgeht, moderner Rosennichtigkeit. Dies ist, wie Dinge sich vermischen, Endspiel der Materie in Fellfarbenmatsch, das unvermeidlich Gräuliche, das Persil so reich macht. Wenn also etwas Einzigartiges vorbeikommt, ist es ein Wunder. Hagelstepp tanzt den Asphalt entlang, schlittert in silbernen Schuhen.
Finally, we're going to read from a poem called Happy Birthday, published in my second book, Was It For This? So this is a poem, the conceit of which is set on a single day, my 41st birthday. It's a poem about trying to find the exact midpoint of your life. You know, when will you walk through that moment, come out the other side? But it had a complicated writing history because I started writing it in January, February of 2020, just before the lockdown, and then once everything closed and schools and nurseries were shut, I stopped writing it and I never got to the end of the day, so it ends at about 11 a.m., which seemed possibly appropriate for a poem about getting to the halfway point in your life. This is a book that's also very largely about childhood and about my relationship with my parents. I'll just say, we don't maybe say anything more about this photo. This is the cover of the American edition, the FSG edition. The British edition has another photo taken by my father. I became quite interested in his sort of photographic practice, in a sense, these early colour photos from the 80s that he'd taken. There will be two sections, Amira will too, 9 and 10, which are about Berlin and about lockdown. And this is a poem that mind wanders a lot. It starts at this tiny moment in the present and goes outside. Happy birthday, 9. It would be months before I lay unblinking on the bed and worked the chalk 2 paracetamol had left across my gums with lemon squash, a pint, while searching, finally, for what was happening. Pleurisy, rib pain, cut glass opacities I thumbed and read the feeds of people in Berlin disputing quarantine, R0, pathogen, the Princess Diamond, why cocoons are never safe. Then watched a video of snow massing right to left across the scientist's window in Pankow until it was the only medium, and all the rosy hologrammed interior, his shaggy head, the MacBook Pro, had been replaced by monochrome. The avenue he lived on with its scrub of park and single taxi turning right, the Moomin softened lines of parked up cars which, like the tram lines and the avenues of linden trees, reached to the grey horizon's grainy limit. 10. Pankow. I went there once, heard jazz, drank amaretto sours, the era of Geheim clubs pre-internet, a nil-light fog, someone had brought a cat. One night I went back with the only bona fide hot man I'd ever fucked. We sat beside his stone-fired oven, smoked up, laughed manically, ate sushi. Once we visited a huge East German statue of a book made out of iron, his fingers fiddling with my gingham dress's straps, then bunching up the skirts to slide inside them, lie there. Afterwards, I had an urge to lay my index finger down his nose and feel straight bone. Also, my speech, so halting normally, surprised me in its glibly dirty fluency, e.g. sitting, facing the oven's dying orange rectangle, riding him only slightly widely. Whole metaphoric sets replaced my usual simple clutch of low percussive English sounds. Now though, on my birthday, a 20-year sagged span, what I remembered wasn't that. Lost German words, old recklessness, even his name, but the chesty froth, doo-doo-be-doo, of the woman in the jazz club singing scat, which seemed, with 40 years to go, the chord progression tediously fixed the apter metaphor. The sound pushed at the room and carried higher than the cigarette smoke, floating.
Happy Birthday. 9. Es sollte Monate dauern, bevor ich ohne zu blinzeln auf dem Bett lag und die Kreide auf meinem Zahnfleisch, hinterlassen von 2 Paracetamol mit frischem Zitronensaft und dem Bier, bearbeitet hatte, während ich danach suchte, was hier eigentlich los war. Pleuritis, Rippenschmerz, milchglasartige Trübung. Ich blätterte und las die Feeds von Leuten in Berlin, die über Quarantäne stritten. R0-Pathogene, die Diamond Princess, warum Kokons nie sicher sind. Dann schaute ich ein Video voll Schnee, der sich von rechts nach links aufschob im Fenster des Wissenschaftlers in Pankow. Bis es das einzige Medium war und all seine rosig hologrammte Einrichtung, sein zotteliger Kopf, das MacBook Pro, wurden ersetzt durch Monochrom, die Allee, in der er lebte, mit ihrem Gestrüpp von Park, einzeln rechts abbiegendem Taxi, den sanften Linien geparkter Autos, die wie die Tramschienen, die Lindenbaumallee, bis zum grauen Horizont reichten, seinem verpixelten Limit. Pankow, da war ich mal. Jazz gehört, Amaretto Sours getrunken. Die Ära der Geheimclubs, Prä-Internet, Nil-Leitnebel. Jemand brachte eine Katze. Eines Nachts ging ich zurück mit dem einzig bona fide heißen Mann, den ich je gevögelt hatte. Wir saßen neben seinem Steinofen, lachten manisch, bekifft, aßen Sushi. Einmal besuchten wir die riesige ostdeutsche Statue eines Buchs aus Eisen gemacht. Seine Finger fiddelten an den Trägern meines karierten Kleids, schoben die Röcke hoch, um in sie reinzugleiten, dort zu liegen. Danach hatte ich den Drang, meinen Zeigefinger auf seine Nase zu legen, geraden Knochen zu spüren. Auch meine Sprache, so stockend, sonst verblüffte mich in ihrem aalglatt schmutzigen Fluss, zum Beispiel sitzend mit Blick auf das im Ofen sterbende, orangefarbene Rechteck, als ich ihn nur leicht ritt, ersetzten breite, ganze metaphorische Sets meinen gewöhnlich simplen Gebrauch niederer, perkussiver englischer Laute. Jetzt aber, an meinem Geburtstag, nach durchgesagten 20 Jahren, fiel mir nicht das ein, verbrauchte deutsche Wörter, alte Rücksichtslosigkeit, noch nicht mal sein Name, eher das selbstgefällig seichte Du-Du-Be-Du der Frau, die im Jazzclub Scat sang, der mit den 40 kommenden Jahren, der beengt starren Akkordfolge, der passenden Metapher, dem Klang, der den Raum erdrückte, höher zu tragen schien, als der Zigarettenrauch schwebte.
Thank you so much. The translations into German that we just heard were commissioned by the festival and made by Rika Schäffler, extra for the occasion of tonight. Hannah, I want to ask you about cities in your writing. There's loads of cities. They seem to be a very inspiring environment for you. Can you say more about it? And also, as far as I understand, you do not live in a metropolis right now. How does that resonate in your writing?
Yes, now I write about rivers and birds, you see. I am wrestling with whether living in a city is necessary for me to write. I hope it isn't, but it's certainly true that in the past, and perhaps this pre-internet word is important too, I actually did find cities more inspiring, places when people looked at you more and you could look at other people more and they could see you looking at them. There's a sort of been a loss of eye contact, I think, over the last, 20, 25 years, that makes cities a little less restless and human to me than they were. But certainly the poems in my first book are largely about, the first poem is called You Very Young in New York. In fact, I didn't live in New York for very long, and when I lived there, I was a graduate student, so I didn't have any money. So some of the descriptions of cocktails, made with elaborate liqueurs and so on, and are actually really based on things that I did later in San Francisco. So there's quite a bit of San Francisco in that poem, and also in the second one in 3 poems. And there's a lot of London everywhere, especially, I think most importantly to me, in the first poem in this book, Was It For This, which is about Grenfell. Some of you may know that the second and final report was published just a week or so ago. Remains a complete national disgrace and a completely predictable but also unimaginable tragedy. So that is not a poem that is about me personally at all in any way, other than as a guilty bystander. But the book as a whole, Was It For This, is about London in a very different way, because it's not about the whole city, just a small sort of pocket of West London where I grew up and lived as an adult also.
And I was wondering, I'm moving on to the pieces from the C section that we've just heard from that poetry section. I think you very convincingly find ways to write about the experience of giving birth, and also, the sublime in it, something that I always find very difficult to find words for. Did you have the idea for the form and the way to do it straight away, or did you work on it for a long time to find the right way to address it?
I did work on that poem for quite a long time, but I began by writing more about my father's death and the sort of hospital settings in which he'd spent the last few months of his life, but then inevitably it sort of led on because of the sheer temporal proximity of those events, exactly 6 months apart. My father died in August of 2014 and my son was born exactly 6 months later in February of 2015. Then when I finished the poem, the book was accepted by Faber, and then I had the chance to revise it the following year. So the following year I'd had another C-section, and unlike the first one, it actually really been a very serious kind of medical emergency where I lost many liters of blood, had multiple transfusions. And so in A Stranger, when I revised it, I think some more of the horror actually of a near-death experience, like an experience where I was really bleeding out, kind of imposed itself over what had been originally there. So the humor perhaps became a little darker in that way. But I have to say, reading it now, I can't imagine writing about my children as children or as people who speak or who might read books. I mean, in some ways, the face in someone's hands is as far as it goes there. I found that childhood has been a topic that, other than my own childhood, has sort of receded from me. It feels, through reasons of privacy and sort of encroachment, that I don't want to write about them anymore.
And could you also say more about the way prose and poetry are intertwined in your practice? In what you write?
Yes, that's a difficult question. My German is very weak, but I suspect that those of you who are listening to the German as well may have formed a slightly different impression. Even of the writing, perhaps it is always difficult to translate something in its original forms. In the first poem in 3 poems, for example, the opening section is written in a loosely rhymed, sort of half rhymed at times, but otherwise quite strict terza rima, and I think that is not possible to repeat in German. So I'm interested in prose at its most prosaic, I suppose, and poetry sometimes, at its most poetic. So the trochaic meter, the catalectic trochaic tetrameter of the description of the form done kind of end game of matter, and sort of what happens when you push them next to each other. I'm not especially interested, although I think it's often assumed that I would be, in prose poetry. I mean, I'm interested in other people's prose poetry, but it's not something that I myself write. I'm interested more in kind of the extremes of the two forms. But I don't feel that I have found really a successful way to cross them. In this central memoir part of this book, most of it is in prose, and it is a memoir about childhood, but using lyric to try to sublimate some of the feeling in some ways into tiny moments that can stand for the whole. I'm not sure if that was really successful, but there was more of a conscious attempt there to push the limits of the two forms.
I think we should take it as an invitation to look closer into the book of Hannah Sullivan. Thank you so much for these brief exchange words here. Thank you also to Mira Czerne for reading the German translations. And now I would like to ask to join me on stage Maria Stepanova and Marcel Kola, who will be reading the German translations of Maria's work. So it was already mentioned in Simone's introduction, but Maria and myself were already planned to sit here a couple of years ago, and it didn't work out. I'm very happy to be here with you together. Welcome, Maria Stepanova. Maria was born in Moscow and studied there at the Maxim Gorky Institute of Literature, and first made her debut as a poet. But she writes also prose and has received many awards for her work. I will mention only a few. For example, the prestigious Russian literary prize Bolshaya Kniga in 2018, and together with her translator into German, Olga Radetskaya, the Literary and Translation Prize Brücke Berlin in 2020, and also the Leipziger Buchpreis zur europäischen Verständigung, so the prize of the Leipzig Book Fair for European Understanding. She's currently a fellow of the Berlin Artist in Residence Program, DAAD. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
So we're now going to listen to a sequence that stems from the collection called the German Winterpoem, or Holy Winter in the English translation. The German edition was published last year by Suhrkamp. So the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having me here. It is a pleasure and an honor. Thank you all so much for being here. And I think we'll start with a small introduction, a few preliminary words. The small sequence I'm going to read, 5 poems, do come from the poem, book-length poem called Holy Winter 2021. It's a pandemic poem, and it is dealing with the stance of a never-ending winter that is overlapping or taking over the countries, the continents, different centuries, different environments, making the poets speak the same language, the language of frozen words. And it is also dealing with Ovid, the first exiled poet, who is also known for writing the first book in the universe that was dedicated to women, historical or mythological women, who were expressing themselves, telling their own stories in their own voices. Ironically, of course, the actual voice behind the voices was a male one, obviously. And I decided sort of to snitch the mic and write a few versions of these female monologues in my own voice. So we're dealing with a few stories, Dido, Ariadne, what else, Penelope, and so on, but actually the names are not important. It is the stories that count. So the first one, D. Кто ты был? Ты, беженец был, забыл, как звали, и откуда сам? Семья на закорках, сын захребетник писается в штаны, отец одно и то же, про то, как его уважали в Совете ветеранов. Путал ты падежи, глаза в прищур, дрожь за пазухой. Если бы не я и мое поставленное хозяйство, и не вдовий мой капитал, где ты был бы ли? Когда с тобой легла, я легла как в лодку, как в зимнее море легла, и вот помалу научилась различать сквозь твое дырявое днище и тяжелый ход морских чудищ, и островы затонувших судов круизных, и гром мотора, когда пограничный катер требует руки на борт и не сопротивляться, и я не сопротивлялась. Но мы уперлись в дно. Ты вышел на сушу под новыми созвездиями, сбросил плавники, отрастил легкие, оставил меня в песке, бывшее дерево, бывшую царицу, бывшую лодку. И если хочу за тобой угнаться, я должна стать огнем и воздухом, как та египтянка, чтобы ты хотел и не мог выгнать из ноздрей мой запах.
D. Wer warst du schon? Ein Flüchtling warst du, der nicht mehr weiß, wie er heißt und wo er herkommt. Huckepack, die Mischpoke, der Sohn eine Niete, ein Hosenpisser, der Vater spult seine Platte ab, wie hoch man ihn schätzte im Veteranenrat. Du konntest nicht deklinieren, die Augen zwei Schlitze, ein Zittern im Hemd. Ohne mich, ohne meine geordnete Wirtschaft und mein Witwenvermögen, wo wärest du jetzt? Gäbe es dich überhaupt noch? Als ich mich zu dir legte, lag ich wie in einem Kahn, in einem Meer im Winter. Erst nach und nach erkannte ich durch deinen löchrigen Kiel das Schlingern der Seeungeheuer, die Gerippe gesunkener Kreuzfahrtschiffe, das Motordröhnen der Küstenwachboote, den Ruf Hände auf die Reling und keinen Widerstand. Und ich leistete keinen Widerstand. Aber wir liefen auf Grund. Du gingst an Land unter neuen Gestirnen, du streiftest die Flossen ab, du ließest dir Lungen wachsen, ich blieb liegen im Sand. Einst ein Baum, einst ein Kahn, einst Königin. Und wenn ich dich einholen will, muss ich Feuer werden und Luft, wie jene Ägypterin, damit du mich aus deiner Nase vertreiben willst und nicht kannst.
Я просыпаюсь на белом, пустом и белом острове, оставленной тобой кровати, и понимаю, что ты меня оставил, и понимаю, что я и есть остров. Человек, сказавший, что человек не остров, не был изолирован в пустой кровати, где белая ткань собой знаменует зиму, выпавшую в строке, где между мной и тобой простое белое, метро, безвидные промежутки, бесчеловечные проспекты, лишенные нас скверы, и нет никакой соединительной ткани, ни шелковой нитки, за которую уцепиться, ни словесных мячиков для налаженной переброски, человек, заключенный в собственной коже, и другой человек, сбежавший из заключения, не пожелавший быть частью архипелага, федеративной республикой, схваченной в объятия зоной территориального присоединения, обнажают как срам свою островную природу. Я вижу береговые скалы, Бог любви колол меня своим стрекалом. Бог сна не удержал меня в своей люльке. Придет на выручку Бог алкоголя, изнутри обнимет, прозяб его виноградник.
Ich werde wach auf der weißen, der leeren und weißen Insel des Betts, in dem du nicht mehr liegst, und begreife, du hast mich verlassen, und begreife, ich bin die Insel. Der Mensch, der gesagt hat, kein Mensch sei eine Insel, war nicht isoliert in einem leeren Bett, wo weißer Stoff das Zeichen gibt für den Wintereinbruch in Zeilen, wo zwischen mir und dir einfaches Weiß liegt, blicklose Metrostrecken, entmenschte Prospekte, Parks, durch die wir nicht gehen, und keinerlei Bindegewebe, kein seidener Faden zum Festhalten, keine Bälle für ein gepflegtes Wort Ping-Pong. Ein Mensch im Gefängnis der eigenen Haut und ein anderer Mensch, der aus dem Gefängnis ausbrach, kein Teil sein wollte des Archipels, kein Föderationssubjekt, kein Objekt in den Armen eines Gebietsanschlusses. Sie enthüllen die Blöße ihrer Inselnatur. Ich sehe die felsigen Küsten. Der Gott der Liebe stach mich mit seinem Stachel. Der Gott des Schlafes warf mich aus seiner Wiege. Einer kommt mir zu Hilfe, der Gott des Alkohols umarmt mich von innen und sein Weinberg grünt.
П. Что у меня? Дом, сын, пяльцы, собака. С видом на море, темная прохладная зала, солнечные пятна на мраморе в полдень, солонина в подвале на всякий случай, как у нас каждый 4-й год не урожай. Если ты письмо увидишь его, спроси, разве я просила его остаться? Все как у людей, как у подруг. У одной муж уехал в город на заработки и там сгинул. У другой завербовался в контрактнике и тоже сгинул. У меня, как у прочих. Напевая, я выполняю свои домашние обязанности. Танцуя, накрываю к ужину. Счастье в личной жизни – это кухня без лишних ртов. Холодные, неопрятные ветры рыщут над водами морей. То и дело из волн высунется непотребная выдумка, одноглазый едок, охочий до нашей плоти, говорящий камень, змеиный остров, ведьма, обращающая человека в свинью, а дальше пусть хоть утопится. Разве я просила тебя вернуться? Я не просила, чтобы приходили и тех, кто делает мне кассу на двойном безо льда и разговорах о моей вечной женственности. У меня едва остается время на то, чтобы в поздних сумерках вымыть ноги и посидеть одной на пустой террасе. Но каждое утро, прежде чем пора протереть столики и повесить открыто, я вышиваю прогноз погоды. На нем ослепительно-синий океан, борей со снегом, зефир с ямочкой, пасть Сциллы, царевна с мячиком, золотое, не относящееся к делу руно, заспанные, необстрелянные дозорные, которых душат голыми руками, трофейный товар в иностранных портах, женские ступни, женские щиколотки. Вышиваю и распускаю дорогу домой. Каждое утро мои прогнозы меняются.
P. Was habe ich? Ein Haus, einen Sohn, einen Stickrahmen, einen Hund, einen kühlen Empfangssaal mit Blick aufs Meer, mittags Sonnenreflexe auf Marmor, im Keller gepökeltes Fleisch für den Notfall, Missernten gibt es bei uns alle 4 Jahre. Wenn du ihn siehst, mein Brief, dann frag ihn, habe ich ihn etwa gebeten zu bleiben? Alles normal, wie bei meinen Freundinnen auch. Der Mann der einen ging in die Stadt, um Arbeit zu suchen, weg war er. Der andere hat sich anwerben lassen von der Armee, weg war auch er. Ich lebe, wie man so lebt. Singend versehe ich meine häuslichen Pflichten. Tanzend decke ich abends den Tisch. Privates Glück ist ein Haus mit nicht zu vielen hungrigen Mäulern. Kalte, schmutzige Winde streichen über die Meere. Ab und zu taucht aus den Wellen ein obszönes Fabelwesen hervor, ein zyklopischer Esser, der scharf ist auf unser Fleisch, ein sprechender Stein, eine Schlangeninsel, eine Hexe, die Menschen zu Schweinen macht. Wen kümmert's, wenn sie im Anschluss ertrinken? Habe ich dich etwa gebeten, zurückzukommen? Auch die anderen alle habe ich nicht hergebeten, die mir die Kasse füllen mit ihren Doppelten ohne Eis und ihrem Gerede vom ewig Weiblichen. Ich schaffe es kaum, mir im letzten Dämmerlicht noch die Füße zu waschen und kurz allein auf der dunklen Terrasse zu sitzen. Aber jeden Morgen, ehe es Zeit wird, die Tische zu wischen und das geöffnet Schild aufzuhängen, sticke ich eine Wetterprognose. Darauf sind zu sehen ein strahlend blauer Okeanos, ein Boreas mit Schnee, ein Zephyros mit Grübchen, die Schlünde der Skylla, eine Prinzessin mit ihrem Spielball, ein goldenes Vlies, das ihr nichts zur Sache tut, verschlafene Wachen, auf die kein Pfeil abgeschossen wurde, man erwürgt sie mit bloßen Händen. Beutegüter im Hafen, in fremden Ländern, weibliche Füße, weibliche Knöchel. Ich sticke den Heimweg und trenne ihn wieder auf. Jeden Morgen ändert sich meine Prognose.
Другая А. Огни гаснут. Наши девочки расходятся по палаткам, чистят оружие, проверяют патроны. Все как положено. Спросишь, как у меня? У меня все в боевом порядке. Какой смысл плакать о пролитом молоке, о щите пробитом, о жизни подвешенной, как меховая обезьянка на веревке, которая скачет туда-сюда? Твое место пустое, темное, спальный мешок сложен, пылится, и ты как не была. Скажешь, военные тоже плачут, как тот в Малой Азии плакал о своем мальчике, который без него пошел в разведку и вернулся с отрезанной головой. Спросишь, как у меня? Я о тебе забыла. Как у тебя не спрашиваю? Муж мальчик и сын мальчик, новая страна, новый паспорт, новая война, старый опыт в зоне вооруженного конфликта, снайперская стрельба по старым подругам. Девочкой маленькой ты мне казалась неловкую. Теперь у обеих иная доля. Быстрее, чем собрать и разобрать автомат, память обо мне соберется и разойдется у тебя под правой отрезанной грудью завтра утром, когда мы займем позиции, и ты заработаешь свой посмертный орден, и я войду в наше посмертное бессмертие.
Eine andere A. Die Lichter gehen aus, unsere Mädchen verziehen sich in ihre Zelte, putzen die Waffen, prüfen die Zahl der Patronen, alles so, wie es sein soll. Falls du wissen willst, wie es mir geht, bei mir ist alles in bester Schlachtordnung. Wozu heulen über verschüttete Milch, einen durchschossenen Schild, ein Leben, das in der Luft hängt, wie einst dieser Äffchen am Gummiband, die auf und niederspringen und vor und zurück. Dein Platz ist leer und dunkel, der Schlafsack zusammengefaltet, verstaubt, als wärst du nie da gewesen. Auch bei der Truppe weint man, sagst du, wie dieser Typ in Kleinasien damals weinte um seinen Süßen, der ohne ihn auf Spähtrupp gegangen war und zurückkam mit abgeschnittenem Kopf. Du willst wissen, wie es mir geht? Ich habe dich vergessen. Wie es dir geht, frage ich nicht. Du hast Mann und Sohn, beides Jungs, hast ein neues Land, einen neuen Pass, einen neuen Krieg und aus dem Alten reichlich Kampferfahrung als Sniper, der jetzt auf die früheren Freundinnen schießt. Ein kleines linkisches Mädchen sah ich in dir. So hat sich unser beider Geschick gewendet. Schneller als ein MG zusammengebaut und wieder zerlegt ist, wird mein Bild sich aufbauen und zerfallen unter deiner abgeschnittenen rechten Brust. morgen früh, wenn wir unsere Stellungen einnehmen und du dir deinen posthumen Orden verdienst und ich mit dir posthum unsterblich werde.
And the last one, И. Девочки мои говорят, бедная И, о, какая муха тебя укусила, милая. Мой МЧ говорит, малыш или моя маленькая. Его бывшая говорит, это или его тёлка. Я почти не нахожу в себе качеств, совпадающих с этими определениями. В последние месяцы я не нахожу в себе места. Перехожу из бара в бар, мне там тесно. Стреляю сигареты у продуктовых. Обхожу дозором заснеженные помойки, будто ищу собираю бутылки или ищу венский стул. Дальше больше. Деревянные скамьи электричек. Пригородные полустанки, бурый наст натоптан, овраги бурелом, колодец с бумажной иконкой, заколоченный клуб, кафе «Морячок», коровник. Чешется кровь под кожей наружу хочет. Тесно и тут, небо низко, поле мало. Хочется бежать, куда, сама не знаю, запрокинув голову, движениями крупа разгоняя мушиное щекотание крови, сильными ногами пожирая километры, без памяти, без устали, без остановки, на вольной воле размыкивая песню про Иву, без музыки, без слов, только ау и ио.
I. Meine Mädchen sagen mir, arme I, oh, was hat dich bloß gestochen, du Liebe? Mein Date sagt Kleines zu mir oder Baby. Seine Ex sagt nur die andere und diese Kuh. Ich kann kaum eine Eigenschaft an mir finden, die diesen Definitionen entspricht. In letzter Zeit weiß ich gar nicht, wohin mit mir. Ich ziehe von Bar zu Bar, es ist überall eng, ich schnorre vom Supermarkt Kippen, patrouilliere über verschneite Müllhalden, als suchte ich Pfandflaschen oder einen Kaffeehausstuhl. Und es wird immer schlimmer. Holzbänke in der S-Bahn, Vorortbahnhöfe, Trampelpfade durch bräunlichen Harsch, Gruben voll Bruchholz, ein Brunnen mit einer kleinen Papierikone, ein mit Brettern vernagelter Club, ein Café zum Matrosen, ein Kuhstall. Subkutan stichelt mein Blut, es will nach draußen, auch hier ist es eng, der Himmel zu tief, die Wiese zu klein. Ich will weg und weiß nicht wohin. Den Kopf in den Nacken werfen, die Kruppe schütteln, das mückenkribbelnde Blut auf Touren bringen, Kilometer fressen mit meinen starken Beinen, ohne Sinn und Verstand, ohne Pause, das Weidenlied in die weite Welt hinausbrüllen, ohne Musik, ohne Text, nur Au und Io.
And just one thing, I want to dedicate this reading to the memory of my late father, Mikhail Stepanov. There is only so much we can do for our dead, but at least we can name them aloud again and again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Stepanova. Can you say more about the book that we just heard excerpts of? I mean, you indicated at the beginning, it's the beginning of the pandemic. You're back in Moscow, right? After you've been away for a while, and then you're in the city that you know very well, and yet everything is different because of the pandemic. How did you come up with Ovid? Mm-hmm. How did it all happen?
Actually, not even in Moscow. It was at our dacha place, the countryside house in the middle of nowhere, actually, just snow and trees and nothingness, 80 kilometers from Moscow. And I was stuck there for a while within this stance of pandemic numbness. I think that is something that is very familiar to anyone who's been through that. This feeling of words that are just being stuck. I was not really able to go forward with my own writing, but after a while, I started rereading different texts, different things that have something to do with the concept of everlasting winter. It was a hectic way of reading. Everything was okay, starting with C.S. Lewis and the story of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe. But then slowly, step by step, I was moving against the timeline. And of course, the first poet who is describing winter as a season, as something that, not as a season, but a season that has no borders, has no definite outcome. It is more of a state than a season, a state where you're being locked in this white nothingness. And that was Ovid and his exile poems. So I started rereading. I've done a couple of rough translations or wild versions of his own, his Exponto, his Tristia, and then it began to rhyme with other texts and other voices.
I actually read a review of your book that was entitled, I don't remember the author, but the title was Ovid Has Got COVID, and I thought that I thought I had to share it with you. You mentioned being in exile in the relation to the pandemic, but you've been in exile yourself for the last 2 years, and I know you don't want to talk about it.
That was not planned. Well, as well as COVID, actually, yeah.
Maria told me she doesn't want to talk about it because she's been talking only about that for the last 2 years, or at least that's the feeling you've got. But I want to ask about your relation to the Russian language while being surrounded by other languages on a permanent basis. Can you say more about that also in relation to your writing?
That's a hard question, and I've been trying to answer it for myself within my own head for the last 2 years and a half, and I still don't have an answer. What I can say that there is a problem, there is an enormous void in the place of something that used to be, for myself, a territory of love and devotion, because that is how things are formed between the poet and her language. It might be a love-hate relationship, but still you are blindly relying on the fact that language is something bigger than you, it is embracing you, you are able to palpitate your way through it. But from where I'm standing now, the Russian language is also a sort of a minefield. It has some memories that seem to be embedded somewhere deep in the inner layers of the language. But now, with this war, it is becoming more and more obvious that at least that the upper layers are infected with violence, infected with the potential of further explosions, if we're taking the metaphor further. And the question is how to communicate with the language. And I don't believe in different forms of language blaming, but what is obvious that if you want to operate, if you want to move through this field, you have to be entirely cautious, care and caution, and a certain degree of hope, nevertheless, is the only thing you can do, the only thing I can do.
What is it that we're seeing in the background? Can it be related to hope somehow?
Yes and no, because, the picture comes and the story comes from the Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm. And what is exhibited and what we're seeing here is a huge number of ex-voto figurines that were pillaged 100 years ago from Cyprus by the Swedish archaeologists of the time. And of course, they did not mean it as pillaging. There was a certain idea of salvation behind the enterprise. But nevertheless, they were excavated, packed, taken away, and exhibited like that. An interesting thing, all these ex-votos were placed together back where they belong. And for me, it looks like an exemplary picture of some unknown universe. All these people, male and female, and some of them are riders, and some of them are centaurs, half people, half horses. But all of them are steering somewhere into the future in futile, maybe, search of an answer that is to come, but we don't know what kind of an answer it is going to be. Or is there an answer? But still we keep on hoping.
Thank you so much, Maria Stepanova, Marcel Collin. The translations we heard were prepared by Olga Radetskaya. And now let me welcome to the stage Logan February and Christian Phillips. Logan February was born in Anambra, Nigeria. In addition to writing poetry, essays, and also lyrics for songs, Logan February is also an LGBTQI+ activist. Logan studied psychology at the University of Ibadan and creative writing at Purdue University. Logan February is currently fellow of the Berlin Artist in Residence program here in Berlin. And in German, we have the volume called Mental Voodoo, published in the translation of Christian Phillips, who's sitting next to me. So it's a great pleasure to have you both here, gentlemen. And we will be listening to a selection of poems from that volume in English and then in German.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and reading in the company of the great other poets, Hannah, Maria, Tahir. Thank you, Carolina, and thank you to the ILB for having us. I will be reading the poems in English and going back and forth with Christian in German to avoid boredom. And we would also humbly request to not have any applause until the poems are done. I think the poems like it better that way, and I will start. Samsara. Sometimes I find myself dangerously close to the meaning of life before it slips away again. I understand this crisis too well. My song is loudest at my ribs with no one close enough to hear it. Mine is the predicament of hiding. Imagine a small brown house, inside it clean rooms full of ghosts, the foreboding of a closet door rattling. Behind it lies a heavy coat of fox fur and black velvet. Beneath that, a boy's racing heart and blood rushing along folded bone, the exact heat I was born into, the self buried within the self, close to the womb. Only in dreams do we remember what is precious. The girl who drowned her guts in battery acid. Her grandfather whose glass eye became a paperweight after he read the news. A delicate wisp of smoke slips out the window into the night. Even fire must separate itself from darkness. Dearly beloved, I am not asking to be sanctified. Pray for a garden to bloom, for a path to become clear. I want to be naked. I want to wander.
Samsara. Manchmal komme ich dem Sinn des Lebens gefährlich nah, aber dann rutscht er mir wieder weg. Ich kenne diese Krise nur zu gut. Am lautesten ist mein Lied in Rippennähe, aber niemand ist mir nahe genug, es zu hören. Mein Dilemma ist das Versteck. Stell dir ein kleines braunes Haus vor, im Inneren reinliche Räume von Geistern bevölkert. Die Ahnung, dass gleich eine Schranktür klappern wird, ein schwerer Mantel dahinter, Fuchsfell und schwarzer Samt. Darunter rast das Herz eines Jungen, rauscht Blut entlang gefalteter Knochen. In dieser Hitze kam ich zur Welt. Ein Selbst begraben im Selbst, in Mutterleibnähe. In Träumen nur erinnern wir uns daran, was wirklich zählt. Das Mädchen, das seine Innereien in Akkusäure getaucht hat. Ihr Großvater, der sein Glasauge nach der Zeitungslektüre immer als Briefbeschwerer gebrauchte. Zart entschlüpft ein Schwaden Rauch durchs Fenster in die Nacht. Selbst Feuer muss sich von Dunkelheit trennen. Ich will, Geliebter, nicht, dass du mich heilig sprichst. Bete nur, dass der Garten blüht und dass der Pfad sich klärt. Nackt will ich sein. Ich will wandern. Selbstporträt mit fremder Zunge. Wir sprechen nur in Echos und Echos sind keine Jugendsprache. Ich will ihn verlernen, diesen toten Dialekt, diese Kunst, den Kopf zu heben und die Hand, ohne dass etwas den Geist erhebt, mich zu öffnen wie eine Tür, die ganz genau nach nirgendwo führt. Ich sitze da und sehe meine Haut abfallen. Manche Hymnen singt man viel zu lange schon.
Self-portrait with foreign tongue. We speak only in echoes, and echoes are not a language of youth. I am unlearning this dead dialect, this art of lifting head and lifting hands, with nothing to lift the spirit, of opening myself like a door that leads nowhere in particular. I sit and watch my skin fall off. Some hymns are sung for far too long. Fuckboys. Lately I've been kissing angels full on the mouth and asking them to keep me sheltered from God and his good red sky. The lavish things are always secret, me with my bounty of lies, me from the underground, eyeing the pristine sunset, bursts of sweet paprika in the air. Me with you out at night, bathing in the clear diamonds that fall instead of rain. Is there a world more blissful than this simple hiding, where we spin to careful acoustics, where you are the executioner? Your warm spring mouth and all of its thrills, your hands melded to my hot skin, your heartbeat, my very own firing squad. I fall to ruin, unraveled around your ankles. I would call you righteous, but you're not the victim. You're not the villain either. You're just an exquisite guy. You, all my orchids and violets, my ravishing thing. I find myself wondering which of God's faces we look to in the middle of the night.
Fuckboys. In letzter Zeit habe ich die Engel voll auf den Mund geküsst und sie gebeten, mich vor Gott und seinem guten roten Himmel zu beschützen. Die überschwänglichsten Dinge sind immer geheim. Ich mit meinem Füllhorn voller Lügen, ich, der aus dem Untergrund den unberührten Sonnenuntergang im Auge, in der Luft süße Anflüge von süßem Paprika. Ich mit dir, nachts, unterwegs beim Baden in klaren Diamanten, die statt des Regens fallen. Wo wäre die Welt je gnädiger, als in diesem simplen Versteckspiel, in dem wir uns zu sorgsamen Akustiken drehen, in dem du der Henker bist? Dein warmer Frühlingsmund mit all seinem Kitzel, deine Hände verschmolzen mit meiner heißen Haut, dein Herzschlag, mein persönliches Erschießungskommando. Ich stürze ins Verderben, um deine Knöchel gewickelt. Ich würde dir Recht geben, aber du bist nicht das Opfer. Auch bist du nicht der Täter. Du bist nur ein sehr exquisiter Typ. Du, all meine Orchideen und Veilchen, mein hinreißendes Ding. Ich frage mich, in welches Gesicht Gottes wir schauen mitten in der Nacht. Aus Stein gemacht. Manchmal isst du einen Apfel oder trinkst Gin auf einer schrecklichen Party, um dich daran zu erinnern, wie weich deine Kehle ist. Manchmal bist du gekleidet mit nichts als deiner heftigen Schwermut, warm gehalten von irgendeinem Umschwung im Abgrund deines Magens. Da denkst du dann, ich bin gar nicht aus Stein, na immerhin. Jeder wird einen gut gemeißelten Jungen für wunderbar halten, aber wer schaut genauer hin? Wer bemerkt den frischen Schimmer über den Augenlidern? Wer fragt, ob das vielleicht doch nicht der allersüßeste Beerensaft ist, der da an deinen Lippen klebt? Und wer streckt sich aus, dran zu lecken? Das passiert selten. Das ist Zärtlichkeit, wie Zähne aus Marmor sich durch die zartrote Apfelhaut beißen. Das ist Liebe, wenn er seinen Mund aus dem Salz deines Kummers zieht und heulend wegläuft, so wie du.
Made of stone. Sometimes you are eating an apple or drinking gin at a terrible party, so you remember the softness of your throat. Sometimes you are dressed in nothing but your heavy emotion, kept warm instead by some shifting in the abyss of your belly that makes you think, oh, I'm not made of stone after all. Anyone can think of a sculpted boy as gorgeous, but who looks close enough to see it, the fresh sheen over the figure's eyes? Who asks if that is, perhaps, not the sweetest juice of soft fruit upon your lips, stretches upward to taste it? That is rare. That is tenderness, like marble teeth breaking the apple's delicate red skin. That is love, when he pulls his mouth from the salt of your grief and comes away crying too. Left. Love does not want this mouth, toothless maw hanging open. My father died and I became no one. In Yoruba, your father is your name. Love does not want this body that belongs to nobody's son. My left hand knows to open itself when I need to find my blood. One must never offer gifts with the left hand. I hold the boy I want to love in my left hand. Love is my left hand closing into a fist. Love is the hand that belongs to nobody.
Links. Die Liebe will nicht diesen Mund, zahnloses Maul, das offen klafft. Mein Vater starb und ich wurde keiner. Auf Yoruba ist dein Vater dein Name. Die Liebe will diesen Körper nicht, der zu niemandes Sohn gehört. Meine Linke weiß sich zu öffnen, wenn ich mein Blut finden muss. Mit der Linken verschenkt man nichts. Links halte ich den Jungen, den ich liebe. Die Liebe ist meine Linke zur Faust geballt. Die Liebe ist die Hand, die niemandem gehört. Pitanga. Die Böden der Erinnerung sind gläsern. Was heißt, das Medikament schlägt nicht an? Was heißt, ich bin wieder auf dem Boden? Was heißt, es ist Juli? Was heißt, die Pitanga blühen? Was heißt, sie streichen die Sträucher rot an? Was heißt, sie sehen wie Feuer aus? Was heißt, ich will sie pflücken gehen? Was heißt, Gefahr zieht mich immer noch an? Was heißt, ich könnte wieder dich wollen? Was heißt, du bist immer noch ein schwarzes Loch? Was heißt, du bist dort, wo ich verschwinde? Was heißt, dass ich dich lieben werde? Was heißt, ich versuche immer noch zu verschwinden? Was heißt, das Medikament schlägt nicht an? Was heißt, ich bin immer noch krank im Kopf? Was heißt, ich hatte recht? Was heißt, ich habe mich geirrt? Was heißt, ich kann mir nicht vertrauen? Was heißt, ich kann dir nicht vertrauen? Was heißt, ich kann in nichts vertrauen? Was heißt, ich brauche Medizin? Was heißt Krankenhaus? Was heißt, es ist Oktober? Was heißt, die Kirschen sollten weg sein? Was heißt, das ist nicht echt? Was heißt, das Medikament schlägt nicht an? Was heißt, die Böden der Erinnerung sind gläsern? Was heißt, ich breche durch? Was heißt, keiner ist da, mich zu fangen? Was heißt, du bist nicht hier?
Pitanga. The floors of memory are glass, which means the medicine isn't working, which means I am back on the floor, which means it is July, which means the pitanga are in bloom, which means they are painting the shrubs red, which means they look like fire, which means I'm going to try to pick them, which means I'm still attracted to danger, which means I could want you again, which means you are still a black hole, which means you are where I disappear, which means I'm going to love you, which means I'm still trying to disappear, which means the medicine isn't working, which means I'm still sick in the head, which means I was right, which means I was wrong, which means I can't trust myself, which means I can't trust you, which means I can't trust anything, which means I need medicine, which means hospital, which means it is October, which means the cherries should be gone, which means this isn't real, which means the medicine isn't working, which means the floors of memory are glass, which means I am falling through, which means no one is there to catch me, which means you are not here. Stillbirth Yemoja. In Yoruba, there is no translation for mismatch and no word for membrane. Skin translates to flesh, translates to body. A person is bound to make them heavy. The cohesion is an only friend. I am the kind of man who is a feather. I spill myself and come unstuck. Whole makes parts. Parts do not make whole. Whole is missing something. The cohesion does not know me, the kind of man who wants to be, the kind of woman who bears children that sound like birds when they cry. There is a word for rebirth, but it connotes the aftermath of a sticky death. A body is bound, so it sinks when it drowns. I am unsure that I have enough names to be something other than what I am.
Totgeburt Yemoja. Auf Yoruba gibt es keine Übersetzung für Fehlpaarung und kein Wort für Membran. Haut übersetzt in Fleisch, übersetzt in Körper. Ein Mensch ist gebunden an ihre Schwere. Die Bindung ist ein einziger Freund. Ich bin die Art von Mann, der einer Feder gleicht. Ich schütte mich aus und löse mich ab. Ein Ganzes formt Teile, Teile, kein Ganzes. Immer fehlt dem Ganzen etwas. Die Bindung weiß nichts von mir, von der Art Mann, der die Art Frau sein will, die Kinder kriegen kann, die wie Vögel klingen, wenn sie weinen. Es gibt ein Wort für Wiedergeburt, aber es verweist auf eine Todesfolge, die klebt. Ein Körper ist gebunden, daher versinkt er, wenn er ertrinkt. Ich zögere, ob meinen Namen reichen, um außer mir noch etwas anderes zu sein?
Okuomo Bibi Yemoja. Lédè Yorùbá kò sí ìtumọ̀ fún àìdọ́gba, kò sì sọ̀rọ̀ àwọ̀ fẹ́lẹ́fẹ́lẹ́. Àwọ̀ ara túmọ̀ sẹ́ran ara túmọ̀ sára. Èèyàn ní láti wà ní síso kí wọ́n lè wúwo. Ìṣọ̀kan jẹ́ ọ̀rẹ́ kan ṣoṣo. Èmi ni irú ènìyàn tí ó jẹ́ ìyẹ́ ẹyẹ. Mo dára mi sọnù, dára mi sílẹ̀. Odidi ló ń dá ìpín, àwọn ìpín ò ṣòdidi. Odidi sọnù kankan. Ìṣọ̀kan náà kò mọ̀ mí, irú ọkùnrin tí ó fẹ́ láti jẹ́ irú obìnrin tí ó bímọ tó ń dún bí ẹyẹ nígbà tí wọ́n bá ń ké. Ọ̀rọ̀ kan wà fún àtúnbí, ṣùgbọ́n ó tọ́ka sí ìgbẹ̀yìn ikú alálẹ̀pọ̀. Ara wà ní dídè kí ó lè rì nígbà tí ó bá kú sómi. Kò dá mi lójú pé mo lórúkọ tó tó láti jẹ́ ohun mìíràn ju ohun tí mo jẹ́.
Todborn Bibi Yemoja. Auf Deutsch gibt es keine Übersetzung für
Àìdọ́gba,
und kein Wort für
fẹ́lẹ́fẹ́lẹ́, àwọ̀ ara,
übersetzt in,
ẹran ara,
übersetzt in
ara,
Ein
Èèyàn
ist gebunden an seine Sprache,
ìṣọ̀kan,
ist ein einziger Freund. Ich bin die Art von,
ènìyàn,
der einer Feder gleicht. Ich schütte mich aus und löse mich ab. Ein Ganzes formt Teile, Teile kein Ganzes. Immer fehlt dem Ganzen etwas.
ìṣọ̀kan,
Weiß nichts von mir. Von der Art,
ọkùnrin,
der die Art
obìnrin,
sein will, die Kinder kriegen kann, die wie Vögel klingen, wenn sie weinen. Es gibt ein Wort für,
àtúnbí,
aber es verweist auf eine Todesfolge, die klebt. Ein
ara,
ist gebunden, daher versinkt er, wenn er ertrinkt. Ich zögere, ob
mo lórúkọ,
reichen, um außer mir noch
ohun mìíràn.
zu sein.
Thank you.
Thank you for the reading, Logan February, Christian Phillips. I want to ask you about these two traditions that you move between and the two languages, Yoruba and English. How do you position yourself in these microcosms?
I don't really have a position. I feel like I have a place more of fluidity because I've always been in between both languages. I grew up with English as a first language, coming from Nigeria, but Yoruba as a mother tongue. So I've always sort of been in between. But since I've not lived in Nigeria, it's sort of a recursive motion. I never am in a single place with it. So it's always great to also get the chance to have a reading in another language outside of English and Yoruba.
Mm-hmm. And in one of the poems, we could exactly like trace the connection back to the language, Yoruba language, and the connection between that language and the body. So correct me if I'm quoting wrong, but it's the skin translates to flesh, translates to body in Yoruba. Can you maybe say more about your relation to the body through language? And I guess that also probably relates to what we're seeing.
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those lines that you write and then you have to spend a lot of the time sort of making sense of it. But I think this is, it is fundamental to Yoruba, the idea that there's something about the body or the physicality that only gets an adjective in order to sort of clarify if you mean the skin or the flesh or the body itself. And this piece is by, it's also the cover, we're lucky to have this. It's by a Nigerian photographer, Rotimi Fani Kayode, and he also is from the Yoruba tradition and lived outside of Nigeria in England. And a lot of his work was also sort of in between African identity in Europe, queer identity, and the tensions of being a queer person, whether in Nigeria or outside of. So yeah, I think in thinking about the body, there's a lot that's implicated in poetry itself. I think the body is a space of intuition and poetry is a product of intuition. So I think they meet somewhere there. But also in language itself, there's so much language that is aimed at the body in any language. So I think that's always something I'm trying to untangle. And I think when I put English and Yoruba together, then I feel like I have a toolkit that I can push something with.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel that your attitude towards these two languages changes because you are outside of, countries in which those two languages are spoken?
Absolutely. I feel like you definitely take a lot for granted when you have your mother tongue around you all the time. And then I remember I was in New York sort of 2 years after I left, and then I heard someone just like on the street speaking Yoruba, and I just like turned because it was so familiar, but also like I haven't heard this in a long time. And because of that, there's always a kind of calibration that happens with the poems where it's sort of taking modes of expression or sort of registers in which you can express certain things and bringing them into English. And also I've been trying to work with translation like we did with the last poem we read. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's also nicely destabilizing to not always be in touch with the main language, because then you maybe can try to make language differently.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it can also influence your own body, right? Mm-hmm. In the way you perceive it. Thank you so much, Logan February. And now I would like to ask to join me on stage Tahir Hamoud Iskil, Joshua Freeman, and Marcel Koller again. Tahir Hamoud Iskil was born in the southwest of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. He's a writer, he's also a film director and an activist, considered one of the most prominent modern poets of the Uyghur language. In 2017, when the Chinese government began the mass internment of Uyghurs, he and his family managed to escape to the United States, where he's been living ever since in exile. Next to me is Joshua Freeman, who was a historian and a scholar and who translated Tahir Hamoud Iskil's work into English. He translated the book, which is a German called In Erwartung meiner nächtlichen Verhaftung, Waiting to be Arrested at Night is the English translation. And this translation served as a foundation for all other translations to other languages. Marcel Koller is going to read the translations into German, who we are very thankful for, to Ulrike Kretschmer. So now we're going to listen to poems from this memoir, Waiting to be Arrested at Night. And you have to know that we're going to listen to poems only, but the memoir consists of large pieces of prose, and then the poems are somewhat intertwined or placed within that prose. And yeah, this is certainly not random places where they are. So I'm looking forward to the reading.
Keşliğinle hayırlı olsun. Aldı bilen düşüncürüp koyma gelim soğuk koyup kılıp sel ağırıp qağalık için avazım taz yaxşı çıkmay şuna mask taqып aldım. Şuna doğru düşünüşünü aldım kılma.
I hope everybody's having a nice evening. First, I'd just like to mention that I have a bit of a sore throat, so apologies if my voice is not what it usually would be.
Mesleki üç parça şiirini Uygurca okup emekçi. Bu üç parça şiir menimki gece tutman kılınışını kütüştügen İslam'a kirgizilgen şiirler.
I'm going to share 3 of my poems with you. All 3 of these poems are included as part of my book, Waiting to be Arrested at Night.
Bunun birincisi Paris'de ezip kılış. Bu şiirini 2015 yılında tuncu qetim chet elge çıkıp Paris'ni ziyaret qilgan chaqda shu chaqdagi do'stlarimiz bilan uchrashib bir ezib qolgan kechirmishlarimiz bayon qilingan bir she'r.
The first of them is called Lost in Paris, and it was inspired by an experience I had in 2015, the first time I visited France. I was visiting with a friend of mine there, and on the way home, I got lost.
Paris'de ezip kılış. Natonish ko'chadagi osmonga qaraydigan tosh, darvozadek ismlar o'yilib midirlamay turgan mening, atrofimda qaynamdek cho'g'ilayotgan shahar sovuq, targa chumdirdi yomg'ir aralash beshimni qaydirib, men uni rasmiy tunib bo'g'icha ezib qolganday qildimda, rostimda ezib qolganligimni bildim. Sina daryosidagi dug' suvi qo'lini qo'qmayli tiqsa taqdiri qo'lga chiqib qolgan shaxsiyatsiz Eiffel munorini balgi qilganning kechada ahamiyati yo'q ediki, ses qipiraydigan kon metroning ishkidagi temir tutqichning vaqtda ko'prayotganligini ko'rdim. Chigish ipdak qatnash xaritasi qeri sargardanning qiliqsiz harakatlardek mujmal tuyulganda 38 yoshlik natunish turk so'q qilgan tavarruk tasvimi dal bulanmay ishdan yanchiqimda asta siqimdilayotganligini angladim. Hamda yangi manzildan va tarix, romantika, atir san'at, nazinin xamxiyal qatorliqlardan voz kechish kerakligini tushundim. Parij menga pichirladi. Ey sho'rpeshona, qandoq kelgan bo'lsang, shundoq ket.
Verloren in Paris. Wie ein Steintor, regungslos verziert mit Namen, starrte ich zum Himmel einer unbekannten Straße, während um mich herum die Stadt tobte und mich schwindelig machte, mich in kaltem Schweiß und Regen tränkte, und noch bevor ich sie wirklich kannte, schien ich verloren, wahrhaftig verloren, wusste ich. Am Abend sinnlos etwas ins Visier zu nehmen, neben dem selbstlosen Eiffelturm, der tapfer in die Seine hinunterreichte, um sein Schicksal aus dem trüben Wasser zu fischen, in der muffigen alten Metro, wo der Türgriff aus Eisen sich abnutzte wie die Zeit, beobachtete ich. Die verknoteten Fäden des Fahrplans schienen durcheinander, wie die Manieren dieses ungehobelten alten Emigranten und die ererbte Gebetskette, die mir ein unbekannter Türke von 38 Jahren gab. Auch sie, sinnlos, wie sie sanft in meiner Tasche klickte, hörte ich. Vorbei an 2 angetrunkenen arabischen Ladenbesitzern, einem lateinamerikanischen Taxifahrer, einem Pizzalieferboten, jemandem, der mit seinem Hund Gassi ging, und keiner von ihnen mit mir gemeinsam verloren, spürte ich. Überdies neue Ziele und auch Geschichte, Romantik, Parfüm, Kunstwerk, Schönheiten, Tagträume etc. Auf sie alle muss ich verzichten, erkannte ich. Paris flüsterte mir zu: O du Unglückseliger, geh auf dem Weg zurück, auf dem du kamst.
İkinci parça şiirim sizlerge nartunuşya. Mana bu şiir şu.
Second poem is called Your Unknown Place.
Bu resim menimki vatanimning bir ko'rinishi bu şiir hozirroq mas keladi.
This image is from my homeland, and I feel like it somehow fits this poem.
Sizlarga nartunuşya. Bu yerda aslida yuqumli qismlar yo'q edi. Biz ba dedik, ba bo'ldi. Bu yerda aslida yıldızlı qumlar yo'q edi. Biz ba dedik, ba bo'ldi. Bu yerda aslida temib turadigan vaqtlar yo'q edi. Biz ba dedik, ba bo'ldi. Bu yerda aslida ko'payadigan yolg'izliklar yo'q edi. Biz ba dedik, ba bo'ldi. Bu yerda aslida sargardon unutishlar yo'q edi. Biz ba dedik, ba bo'ldi. Ammo biz hech narsani yo'q edi deb yo'q qilamadik. Hatto ba qilganlarimizni.
Dein unbekannter Ort. Hier waren die Namen der Menschen nicht ansteckend. Wir sagten, dass sie es waren, begab es sich. Hier gab es keinen Sand, dem Wurzeln wuchsen. Wir sagten, dass es ihn gab, begab es sich. Hier tropfte die Zeit nicht von den Wänden. Wir sagten, dass sie das tat, begab es sich. Hier vervielfältigte sich die Einsamkeit nicht. Wir sagten, dass sie das tat, begab es sich. Hier war der Himmel nicht von 1000 Augen gesprenkelt. Wir sagten, dass er das war, begab es sich. Hier gab es kein flüchtiges Vergessen. Wir sagten, dass es das gab, begab es sich. Dennoch konnten unsere Worte hier nichts ungeschehen machen, auch nicht das, was sich durch uns begab.
Ahırkı şiir nime idi? Bu şiir 2017-yılı ben ailem bilen öz vatanımdan keçip Amerika'ya kelip birinci qatim, tunji qatim yazgan şiirim. Bu şiirde şu bizning bir ailening ki bütün qish jarayonidagi his tuyg'ularimiz bayon qilingan.
The last poem is called What Is It? It was the first poem that I wrote after leaving my homeland and coming to America with my family, and this poem expresses a lot of the feelings that myself and my family members experienced after being forced to leave our homeland.
Nemeydi? Nemeydi? Yiroqlardan, Yaysman suvning orqa tarafidan tushib qolmay, menga eslib billa kagini. Sarg'uch urg'i yozilgan ojiz qasammi, qiypash oldi tarafdagi tavakkülchilikmi yoki қолдан қолға өткен қатмақат хірәлікмі. Бұл күллә үзік ұппықлағы толып кетті. Үзік. Қич пәсліде чамыданның қат-қиттігі өшірінс тән беріш, өлчәмден ешіп кәсі яқшы күман, баған сыр дауымнасы тұйық yol, ішкінші қәветті тоқтысы көч, неме еді саңа менің діхі тірік екенлігімні білдірмегені. Менің батыным білән зайырым şu kadar addi. Әй қар көз. İşçiden қызырдыған бір тіптәрәқ ташқа айланар менің енімді. Bir bağ құшбой адрасман, іштік өсәр, пұрәкләп ечілар, бұрынғы bir шик төвіде.
Was ist das? Was ist das, das da aus weiter Ferne, von jenseits des kuppelförmigen Wassers bei mir blieb, das da mit mir kam? Ein schwacher Schwur, geschrieben in den gebenden Dunst, Wagemut in Schieflage oder das vielschichtige Halbdunkel von Hand zu Hand gereicht? Die Tage sind voller zerschlagener Horizonte, zerschlagen. In der Weglaufsaison, wenn sich die Kapitulation tief im Koffer versteckt, wenn hehre Zweifel das Höchstgewicht überschreiten, wenn Sackgassen nicht enden, wenn der Exodus im 2. Stock ins Stocken gerät, was ist das, das euch davon abhält zu sehen, dass ich noch am Leben bin? So schlicht sind meine Seele innen und mein Gesicht außen, o Dunkeläugiger, dass ein Baum, sich von innen heraus rötend, neben mir zu Stein wird. Ein Büschel süß duftenden Kamelgrases wächst rasch und erblüht auf der Schwelle der Vergangenheit.
Thank you very much.
Tahir, you mentioned in a conversation here at the festival that you are a sort of a rebel poet in regard to the Uyghur tradition of poetry. Can you elaborate on this rebelliousness, please?
Бүгінгі башқа бір сөhbətdə özünüzü bir asi şair деп təsvirləgəndiniz. Uyğur ənənəsi nisbətən özünüzün nəmişqə, özünüzü asi şair деп təsvirləgəndiniz azraq kəndir bir adamsınız.
Əslində bu sualğa Joshua Freeman bək yaxşı cavab verələydi əslində.
He says Josh should maybe answer this question.
Uyghur ədəbiyyat, Uyghur şeiriyyətinə aid uzun tarixi bir şeiriyyət. Şuna tarixi uzun, ənənə qancha küçlük olğan sırə onunki ənəvi küçümü şuncha küçlük oldu. Onundan qutulub çıxmaq biraz təs oldu.
Uyghur poetry has a really long history, and the longer the history a poetic tradition has, the more force it takes to separate yourself from it.
Onun üstüge Uygurlarla ait uzun yıl intan bikin malatda. Yani özünün şu rayında qamalğan bir şekilde yaşap, dünyanınki başqa yerlerdeki edebiyatların uçuruşu fürsəti bolmagan.
For a very long time, Uyghurs have been obliged to live somewhat cut off from the world in their region, and for that reason, Uyghur literature has had fewer opportunities to interact with other literatures.
Mənimdən ait tələlik alda 17 yaşımda Beyjanğa verib okudum, Xanzu tili öyrəndim. Şunun bilan dünya edebiyatıyla uçraşdım. Şu jarayonda mən özümə xas bir xil başqa bir şeir icadiyat yolunu tuttum.
I was really fortunate when I was 17 to go study in Beijing, where I learned Chinese, and through that came to encounter world literature, and that's part of why I ended up developing a pretty distinctive style.
Mening şu yazgan şeirlerim Uyghur şeiriyyətininki asasi iqamidən izchil turda girvəkdə turib gəldi. Çünki bunu jiq adam ənənvi şeirlarni yaxşı gördü, ommabop şeirlarni yaxşı gördü. Bunda şeirlarni yaxşı gördüğü yaşlar var bir türküm. Ama jiq adam tərəfindən qəbul qılınmagandikan mən oxşaş, mən yoki mən oxşaş bir türküm şairlar Uyghur ədəbiyyatına nisbətən bir xil asi hesablayırıq.
So I've always been kind of on the edge of the mainstream or outside the mainstream of Uyghur poetry, and it's not just me. there's a number of poets who are kind of in the same category, and even if we're outside the mainstream, there are some people that like our work, younger people in particular. But it's worth mentioning that it's not quite the mainstream.
Can you say more about your current contacts to the diaspora while being in the US, to your fellow poets who write in Uyghur language?
Amerikadagi vaqtingizda muhojiratdagi boshqa Uyg'ur shoirlar bilan bo'lgan aloqangiz haqida bir narsa deya olamsiz?
Bizni ayt yaxshi aloqamiz bor muhojiratdagi Uyg'ur shoirlar ichida. Biz bu shoirlar bilan aloqa o'rnatib, uyushma qurib, Uyg'ur tilida she'r yozishni chet elda davomlashtiryapmiz.
We tend to have excellent relations. Those of us Uyghur poets working in the diaspora, we have all different sorts of events, and we've created the World Uyghur Writers Union. So there are all of these efforts to keep Uyghur language and literature alive and flourishing in the diaspora.
Biznikimda chet eldagi diasporadagi Uyg'ur shoirlarining she'rlarini to'plab nashr qilish bilan bir vaqtda yana vatan ichida turmalardagi shoirlarning she'rlarini amal qilib nashr qilish, tarjima qilish va boshqa jihatlardami, hatto ularga yordam berish jihatlardami planlarni qilyapmiz.
We make all kinds of efforts to make sure that collections of Uyghur poets can be published in the diaspora, and we are working now to make sure that imprisoned Uyghur poets back in our homeland, that their work can be published as well.
And I wanted to ask one last question that refers to the memoir, that expresses the feeling or reflects this feeling of constant fear, waiting to be arrested at night. Was it clear for you from the beginning that this is going to be prose and poetry memoir, or is it something that emerged while you started writing it?
Üzülmeydigan qorqunç haqida bir narsa so'rag'im kelyapti-da, undan yana birisi mushkichda tutqun qilinishni kutish degan so'zdan keladi. Shu üzülmeydigan qorqunch haqida bir narsa deyapsiz. Yana birisi beshidla siz mushu xotirni ham proza, ham she'r qilib yozmoqchimi yoki ashuna bo'lib qoldimi?
Haqiqatan bu qo'rqinch, bu üzülmey kelgan qo'rqinch zulmni aytdi, odamni zeriktiradigan bir ish bu. Men unda hissiyatni faqat yaxshi ko'rmayman.
One gets really tired of the constant fear. I can't stand that feeling.
Bu aslimini men Amerikaga kelibla oilam bilan shunda bir kechirmishimni yezish uyanbatdi, lekin oilaniki yangi kelganda bir ko'chman oilaniki turmushni qamdash naytim muhim ta'xirsiz ish bo'lg'achqa buni dastlabda qilmadim. O'zimning turmush alakchilikda bo'ldim bir mezgil.
I wanted to write a memoir after I came to the United States, but the everyday life demands of being an immigrant in a new country that faced my family meant that at first I just didn't have time to do this for a while.
Bu aslimni yozgan chog'da pek she'r masalasini o'ylab ketmagan. Chunki bu aslimning o'zi bir tragediya to'g'riliq bir xotira bu. Lekin keyin kitob shakllanish jarayonida biz ba'zi she'rlarni shu kitobning temasi bilan o'xshash tuyg'udagi ba'zi she'rlarni kitobga kirgizishni muvofiq deb qarab buni joshlarga maslahatlashdik. Oxiri shu she'rlarni kirgizdik, bir turkum she'rlarni.
At first, I didn't really think about including poetry in the memoir. It's a memoir about a tragedy. But in the process of preparing the memoir, we did end up deciding to put in some poems that kind of matched the themes or the feelings that were represented in the book. And I actually, Josh and I talked about what poems might fit, so some poems ended up going into the book. If you're a poet, there's no escaping poetry.
Thank you so much. I have one announcement. Tomorrow, Tahir Hamoud Iskil and Joshua Freeman will participate in an event called Shared Trauma, a Night of Remembering, organized by the Documentation Center Flucht, Vertreibung, Versöhnung, so Flight Displacement Reconciliation. This is at 6 p.m. Thank you so much for the reading. Please stay on stage for another moment. We are approaching the end of this year's Poetry Night, and I would like to invite everybody who participated to join me on stage once again, since we are a really big team. Hannah Sullivan, Maria Stepanova, Logan February, and also Mira Czerne, Christian Phillips. Marcel is here. I think I mentioned everyone. Please join us on stage. Thank you, dear audience, for your kind attention and also patience. Thank you to Simone Schröder and Lena Klinkenberg for their kind help in organizing this event. We have books for sale. There is a book stall brought to us by the partner bookshop Dussmann, das Kulturkaufhaus. If you feel like having a closer look into what we've heard here, please invite it to do so. There will be book signing in the upper foyer by all of our authors, so please feel free to approach them if you would like to have a signature in your book. The festival is still on for another 2 days. Please do check out the program. There are more highlights to come. I'm Karolina Golimowska. It was a pleasure to host this evening, to be here with you, to lead you through this wonderful poetry. The bar is open for another half an hour. Please stay with us, talk to us. We're looking forward. Enjoy your evening. Good night.